Her ex laughed at her low-paying job in front of their daughter. Then she pulled out a letter. Nora adjusted her name tag as she pushed the mop bucket down the empty school hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold reflection on the polished floors she had just cleaned. Her hands were cracked from chemical exposure, and her back ached from hours of scrubbing, but she carried herself with quiet dignity. Every paycheck, no matter how small, went toward keeping her daughter Amber fed, clothed, and enrolled in a decent public school. Nora had long let go of dreams that once involved law school or courtrooms. Now her life was ruled by shift schedules, worn-out gloves, and lesson plans that didn't belong to her. But to her, it wasn't failure, it was survival. Amber waited for her every night with homework in hand, and that made it worth it. The staff rarely noticed her, though the students sometimes offered hesitant smiles. To most people, she was just a custodian, someone who blended into the walls. Yet, to Amber, she was a hero. Nora always arrived home exhausted but determined to listen, to encourage, to remind her daughter that no situation defined a person's worth. She would say, "Even if my hands get dirty, my heart stays clean." It became a mantra. Still, sometimes, while wiping down chalkboards or emptying trash bins, Nora would glance at the bulletin boards, filled with photos of graduates, college acceptance letters, and smiling teachers, and wonder what her own life could have been if it hadn't been derailed by choices made in the name of love and trust. On a rainy Saturday afternoon, Nora brought Amber to a local cafe for her monthly supervised visit with Dylan, her ex-husband. He was already seated when they arrived, dressed in a tailored blazer and tapping on his smartwatch with impatience. His eyes drifted from Amber to Nora's uniform, wrinkled and stained with faint bleach marks. He chuckled under his breath, loud enough to sting. "Still wearing that janitor badge, huh?" he said, smirking. "Bet Amber loves the smell of disinfectant on her mom." Nora clenched her jaw and chose not to respond. Amber shifted uncomfortably in her seat, looking between her parents with silent confusion. Dylan leaned back, throwing one arm over the booth. "Honestly, it's tragic," he added, "to see someone waste their life wiping kids' gum off desks." Nora calmly unzipped her jacket and folded her hands in her lap. She had long learned that arguing with Dylan was like shouting into the wind. Amber reached for her napkin and began drawing little hearts, pretending not to hear the jabs. Dylan's voice dropped to a condescending whisper. "You know, if you weren't so proud, maybe you could have asked me for help. But you always had to be Miss Independent." Nora let out a slow breath, locking eyes with him for the first time. "I didn't ask you for help because I learned the hard way what your kind of help costs," she said, her voice steady. Dylan scoffed but didn't reply. Amber, sensing the tension, asked if they could go home early. Nora stood and guided her daughter toward the door, her back straight, ignoring the eyes she knew were watching. Their marriage had begun with bright hopes and quiet promises, like most do. Dylan was charming back then, ambitious, funny, and full of grand plans. Nora, barely 20 and still juggling community college classes, was swept off her feet by his confidence. He said he'd make enough money for both of them. "You'll never have to work if you don't want to," he told her. And for a time, it felt like he would keep that promise. But when the market crashed and Dylan lost his job in finance, everything changed. He refused to take a lesser position, blaming the world instead. He drank more, stayed out later, and accused Nora of dragging him down. When she took a part-time cleaning job to make ends meet, he mocked her for it, calling it a humiliation. Their daughter was only 4 when Dylan walked out. He didn't leave with a suitcase, just silence. Nora remembered watching from the living room window as he climbed into a rideshare car without a backward glance. She hadn't heard from him in months, until a lawyer contacted her about a visitation agreement. In court, Dylan wore his best suit and played the part of the wronged man, blaming Nora for stifling his ambitions. The judge granted him supervised visits, citing a lack of financial stability and emotional volatility. Nora said nothing throughout the proceedings. She didn't need to. The truth was written across years of bank statements and bruised dignity. She walked out of that courtroom with her daughter's hand in hers and a vow to never rely on Dylan again. The school gymnasium buzzed with chatter and laughter during the parent-teacher mixer. Nora stood awkwardly near the back, her work uniform still on, having come straight from her shift. She spotted Amber sitting with her classmates, proudly holding a paper with a gold star. Nora smiled and waved. But when she turned back toward the buffet table, she heard the whisper. "Is she one of the janitors?" said a mother in pearls, staring at her with raised eyebrows. Another woman leaned in, whispering something that made them both laugh. Nora flushed but kept her composure. She moved to the corner, eyes down, sipping the lukewarm punch. A few minutes later, the principal took the stage to thank parents for their involvement. As applause erupted, Nora clapped quietly, only to notice a man nearby sneering in her direction. "Look," he whispered to his wife, "even the cleaning crew's trying to blend in. Wonder what she's doing here." Nora felt her throat tighten, but then Amber ran over, beaming. "Mom. My teacher said I'm good at numbers, like really good. She wants to see if I can join the math team." Nora knelt and hugged her tightly, blinking back tears. In that moment, the room's whispers faded. No one knew the sacrifices behind that smile. Nora stood and kissed Amber's forehead. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she whispered. And then, just loud enough for the whisperers to hear, she added, "You'll never need to hide who you are." Late that night, after Amber had gone to sleep, Nora sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold chamomile tea and a faded envelope in her hand. It was the letter she had written to Dylan 3 years earlier, right after the divorce. The paper was creased from being folded and unfolded countless times, the ink slightly smudged. She had poured out everything she never had the courage to say aloud, how he broke her trust, how she kept the family afloat while he drank and disappeared, how their daughter deserved better. But she never mailed it. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was futility. She tucked it away in a drawer where she kept bills, old report cards, and little drawings from Amber. Tonight, though, something was different. Nora reread the letter, her hands trembling slightly. With each line, she felt her old pain giving way to something sharper and more focused. She picked up a pen and began writing a new letter, shorter, firmer. This one didn't plead for understanding. It contained numbers, figures, and the beginning of something official. It wasn't just a letter. It was a statement of intent. She sealed it and placed it in her bag. She wasn't sure when she'd give it to him, but she knew the time was coming. Not out of vengeance, but because one day, Dylan would need to see how far she had come without him, and how little his approval had ever mattered. On Monday morning, before heading to her shift, Nora tucked the sealed envelope into a small zippered pouch in her bag. She didn't know why she brought it. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was because deep down, she was preparing for something. That envelope, filled with legal documents, financial statements, and the confirmation of a dormant asset now in her name, felt heavier than paper should allow. It wasn't wealth, not yet, but it was the first real glimpse of a path forward. For years, Nora had believed opportunity was something long gone. But this envelope whispered otherwise. Still, she kept quiet. Even Amber didn't know. At school, Nora went about her duties as always. She cleaned the cafeteria before the bell rang, then sanitized bathrooms between classes. Occasionally, she'd catch sight of Amber walking with her friends, her daughter's shy smile a source of quiet strength. Nora paused once by the teacher's lounge, overhearing a conversation about an alumni scholarship fund, something Nora had once dreamed of applying for, long before diapers and eviction notices replaced textbooks and lectures. As she moved on, her fingers brushed the side of her bag, feeling the rigid edge of the envelope. Maybe that letter wasn't meant for Dylan. Maybe it was meant for herself, a reminder that even broken timelines could be rewritten. Amber sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, pencil tapping her notebook, brows furrowed in concentration. "This problem has too many numbers," she muttered. Nora, still in her uniform, crouched beside her. "Let's break it down," she said, walking her daughter through the multi-step equation. Amber's eyes lit up midway. "Oh, that's why it's 28, she said, scribbling quickly. Nora smiled, but it wasn't the solution that struck her, it was how easily Amber grasped it. Math had always been Nora's favorite subject, once upon a time, and now, it was like watching a younger version of herself unfolding on the page. The next day, Amber's teacher, Mrs. Callahan, stopped Nora in the hallway. "Your daughter's incredible," she said. "She solved a logic puzzle faster than most adults could. We want to test her for the accelerated math program." Nora blinked in surprise, her mop halfway into the janitor's closet. "She's just good with numbers," she said modestly. But the words stuck with her throughout the day. Maybe this was the start of something bigger. Maybe Amber wouldn't have to scrub floors to survive. Maybe, just maybe, Nora's sacrifices were finally starting to bloom into something extraordinary. It was the last day before spring break, and Nora had promised Amber she could wear her favorite dress. As Amber twirled around the living room, Nora bent down and examined her daughter's sneakers. The soles were worn flat, the sides splitting. Nora sighed and checked her wallet. $28. New shoes would have to wait. She found an old tube of glue, patched the edges, and tightened the laces. Just for a few more weeks, she whispered to herself. Amber didn't complain. She never did. But at school, a few students giggled behind her back. "Is that duct tape?" one of them asked as Amber passed by. She didn't cry until she got home. That weekend, Dylan arrived for his scheduled visit. He scoffed when he saw Amber's patched shoes. "You're really sending her out like that?" he asked Nora, shaking his head. "Maybe if you worked a real job, she wouldn't look homeless." Amber looked away in shame, and Nora's face flushed with restrained fury. She stepped forward, voice calm. "If money solved everything, you wouldn't have walked away from both of us." Dylan sneered. "Well, clearly, you're doing great, mopping up cafeterias and patching shoes." He laughed cruelly and turned to Amber. "Maybe one day, Mommy will afford real shoes for you." Nora didn't respond. She simply picked up her bag, where the envelope waited in silence. The knock at the door came just before dinner. Nora opened it to find Mrs. Callahan standing on the porch, holding a small gift bag and wearing a kind smile. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, "and I wanted to drop something off for Amber." Inside the bag were a pair of gently used sneakers in Amber's size, nearly new. "They belong to my daughter," the teacher explained, "but she outgrew them so fast, they've barely seen daylight." Nora hesitated, pride clashing with gratitude, but Amber appeared beside her, eyes wide. "They're pink," she gasped. "Can I try them on?" Mrs. Callahan nodded, and Amber rushed inside. Once seated in the living room, Mrs. Callahan glanced at Nora. "I don't mean to intrude, but your daughter's special. She has potential. With the right guidance, she could get into the top math programs, scholarships, academic tracks. But she'll need help." Nora nodded slowly. "I've never asked for much. I've just been trying to keep us afloat." The teacher reached into her bag and pulled out a brochure. "This is from a local mentorship nonprofit. They help families like yours navigate academic opportunities. You don't have to do it alone." Nora looked at the glossy paper in her hand, then back at the smiling woman before her. For the first time in years, she felt like someone saw her not as a janitor, but as a mother fighting for her child. Flush with renewed hope, Nora decided to visit the community center where adult night classes were offered. She walked in after her shift, clutching an application for a paralegal certificate program. The counselor at the desk skimmed through her paperwork. "You're missing your high school diploma," he said flatly. Nora's heart sank. "I dropped out in my senior year," she admitted. "But I've been working ever since, and I'm ready now." The counselor shook his head. "Unfortunately, without that diploma or a GED, we can't enroll you." He handed back the form, and with it, the weight of her past came crashing back. Outside, Nora sat on a bench, watching students half her age come and go with backpacks slung over their shoulders and hope in their stride. She stared at the application, now crumpled in her lap. So many doors had been closed to her, and even when she found the courage to knock again, the locks hadn't changed. She thought of Amber, of Mrs. Callahan, of the shoes, and of Dylan's sneering laugh. She pulled out her phone and searched for GED programs nearby. If the world demanded credentials, then she'd find a way to earn them, one night class, one exam, one quiet triumph at a time. The shrill ring of the alarm pierced the school hallways, sending students and staff into swift motion. Nora was mopping near the science wing when the announcement echoed, "This is a drill. Proceed to the nearest exit." As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed a boy in a wheelchair struggling near the stairwell, eyes wide with panic. The aides had apparently missed him in the shuffle. Without hesitation, Nora rushed over, crouched beside him, and calmly said, "Let's get you out, sweetheart." She wheeled him toward the service elevator, using her master keys to access it. The boy gripped her sleeve tightly, clearly shaken. Once outside, a teacher ran up, breathless. "I didn't even realize he wasn't with the others." "Thank you." Nora simply nodded and gave the boy a reassuring pat. What she didn't realize was that another staff member had recorded the moment on their phone. That evening, the video, titled "Custodian Saves the Day," was shared on the school's parent forum, spreading rapidly through the community. Comments poured in praising her courage and presence of mind. But Nora didn't seek applause. She had simply done what anyone with a heart should do. Still, as she sat at her small kitchen table that night and watched the video on her phone, a quiet pride glowed inside her. Maybe people were finally seeing more than her mop. The next morning, Nora arrived at work early, as usual. As she opened the supply closet, she overheard two teachers chatting near the lounge. "Did you see that video? I had no idea she was that sharp." The other replied, "I always just assumed she was, well, you know." They laughed softly. Nora didn't step forward or interrupt. She stood still, holding a box of gloves, heart sinking at how quickly kindness could still be met with condescension. She wasn't looking for validation, but hearing herself spoken about like an anomaly, as if competence and dignity were rare for someone in her role, stung deeply. During lunch, one of the office staff brought her a coffee and offered a polite smile. Everyone's talking about how brave you were, she said. Thanks for making us look good. Nora smiled faintly, unsure whether to feel flattered or used. She returned to her work quietly, more aware than ever that respect often came with conditions. Still, her focus remained where it always had, on Amber, whose bright eyes and hopeful questions kept her grounded. That evening, she packed the lunch boxes, reviewed Amber's math homework, and sat down with her GED prep book. Praise might be fleeting, but knowledge, that was hers to keep forever. While cleaning out the small storage closet at home, Nora stumbled upon a dusty cardboard box. Inside were items from a life she'd almost forgotten, old class notebooks, faded photographs, and a cloth-bound journal. She flipped it open and was instantly transported to the voice of her 17-year-old self. The entries spoke of college dreams, early crushes, and the giddy excitement of acceptance letters from community colleges. But as the pages went on, the tone changed. There were scribbles about Dylan, how charming he was, how much she believed in their future, and then, toward the end, raw confessions of fear as their financial situation spiraled. Nora sat for hours reading through the pages, each entry a window into her younger self's heartbreak and resilience. The final entry was dated the day after she learned she was pregnant. "I guess school can wait," it read. "He said he'll take care of us." Nora closed the book and let it rest on her lap. She wasn't bitter, just sobered. That girl had trusted too deeply, sacrificed too quickly. Now, she would make sure Amber knew that her mother hadn't given up, but had simply been rerouted. Carefully, she placed the diary back into the box and labeled it, "For Amber. Someday." Because her daughter deserved to know the whole truth, not just the struggle, but the strength behind it. One breezy afternoon, as Nora folded laundry on the porch, Amber joined her with a question. "Mom, did you want to be a lawyer?" Nora blinked. "Where'd you hear that?" Amber held up the old diary, cradled in her arms like a treasure. "I read some of it. I'm sorry. I just wanted to know more about you." Nora hesitated, then smiled softly. "It's okay. I wrote it to remember who I was." They sat side by side, and for the first time, Nora told her daughter about those early dreams, about scholarships left unclaimed, and about how Amber's birth had changed everything, but never in a way she regretted. Amber listened closely, her eyes wide. "I think you'd make a great lawyer," she said. Nora chuckled. "Well, first I need to pass my GED." Amber grinned. "I'll help you study. We'll be like classmates." In that moment, something shifted between them, a deeper connection formed not just by love, but by mutual understanding. Nora no longer had to shield Amber from the truth. Her daughter didn't see failure when she looked at her, only strength. And that night, when Nora opened her prep book, Amber sat beside her with a notebook of her own. For the first time, Nora didn't feel alone in her learning. She felt supported. She felt seen. A week later, Nora received a formal envelope in the mail. The sender's name was unfamiliar, Thompson and Blake Legal Services. Curious and slightly anxious, she opened it. Inside was a letter notifying her of an unclaimed asset from a former client she once cared for years ago during a short-lived job as a home aide. Mr. Whitaker had been elderly, reclusive, and kind. She had read to him, prepared his meals, and treated him with dignity until he passed away. The letter explained that he had named her as a beneficiary in his will. A small trust fund had matured in her name. Heart-pounding, Nora made an appointment to speak with the lawyer in person. She sat across from a gray-haired man in a quiet downtown office who confirmed everything. It's not millions, he said, but it's more than enough for a down payment on a home or to fund your education. Nora felt her throat tighten. Years of scraping by, and now, this miracle from a man long gone. He said you treated him like a person, the lawyer added. Said no one had in a long time. Nora blinked back tears. She left the office holding a folder of legal documents, tangible proof that kindness, even the quiet kind, echoes far beyond what we expect. Nora sat at the kitchen table late into the night, reading the details of the trust fund. Though modest compared to fortunes she'd only heard about, it was more than anything she'd ever had. A balance that had quietly grown over the years now stood at nearly $72,000, an amount that felt surreal. With careful planning, it could change the trajectory of her life and Amber's. Nora didn't rush to call anyone. She simply sat there, fingers tracing the edges of the paperwork, letting the reality settle in. For the first time in years, she felt a door opening. Not a fantasy, not a wish, but an actual, living possibility. The next morning, she scheduled an appointment with a financial advisor recommended by the lawyer. They discussed conservative investments, tuition possibilities, and savings plans. The advisor, a warm woman named Brenda, smiled after reviewing the documents. "You've been given a rare second chance," she said gently. "What do you want to do with it?" Nora didn't hesitate. "I want my daughter to have every opportunity one didn't. And I want to go back to school." For the first time in years, her dreams weren't made of dust or denial. They had form. They had weight. They had a future. As Nora walked home from the financial office, her thoughts turned to Dylan. She hadn't seen him in weeks, and their next visit with Amber was scheduled soon. Part of her wanted to tell him, to show him how far she had come. She imagined placing the financial papers on the table, watching his smug grin falter. But another part of her resisted. It wasn't about revenge. Or was it? That question lingered. Would it feel like power, or pettiness? That night, she opened her drawer and took out the original sealed envelope. She replaced the old contents with copies of the new documents, trust details, a new GED registration, and proof of the mentorship program for Amber. It was a quiet message, a subtle one: "Look what I became even when you left me to fall." She didn't want him to beg or apologize. She didn't need that anymore. But she did want him to see that her life didn't just continue, it rose. A week later, Nora received a letter from Dylan's lawyer. He was filing for full custody of Amber. The justification? Lack of financial stability and insufficient living conditions. Nora's hands trembled as she read the letter, rage and disbelief washing over her. After years of near silence and infrequent support, he now wanted to claim the very child he abandoned. The audacity stunned her. And yet, part of her had always feared this day would come. Dylan had always hated losing control. Nora met with her public defender, who reviewed her case. "He's trying to exploit your old situation," the attorney said. "But now, you have leverage. Document everything: your finances, home conditions, school records." Over the following weeks, Nora built a wall of evidence. Every report card, every medical appointment, every bill paid in full, she compiled it all. Her life, once used against her in court, would now defend her. She would not let Amber be taken, not by someone who saw parenthood as performance. The court date loomed. On the morning of the hearing, Nora arrived dressed neatly, holding her documents close to her chest. Dylan sat across from her with his lawyer, looking confident, leaning back with arms crossed. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, called the case forward. As arguments began, Dylan's attorney painted a picture of Nora as incapable, stuck in a cycle of poverty. Nora sat still, silent, but her turn would come. Then, unexpectedly, the principal of Amber's school entered the courtroom. Nora hadn't known Mrs. Rutledge would come, but there she stood, asked to testify as a character witness. "I see Nora daily," she began. "She's not just a custodian, she's a role model. Her daughter is thriving. And I can say without hesitation, this child is safe, supported, and loved." Dylan's face stiffened. Nora felt a warmth rise in her chest, not triumph, but gratitude. Someone saw her. Someone stood up. As the final portion of the hearing unfolded, Nora stood to speak. She didn't recite a rehearsed statement. Instead, she told the judge about the years she spent scraping by, cleaning toilets with a toddler asleep in the staff room, studying late at night after putting her daughter to bed. She spoke of Amber's intelligence, her dreams, and the stability she built, not with luxury, but with sacrifice. "My daughter doesn't need wealth," she said, "she needs truth. And she knows where that lives." The judge reviewed the materials in silence, then looked at Dylan. "You had years to participate in your daughter's life meaningfully. Why now?" Dylan stuttered, offering vague responses. The judge frowned, her tone final. "This court sees no reason to alter the current custody arrangement. Full custody remains with the mother." Nora closed her eyes. Relief wasn't loud, it was quiet, like rain easing after a long drought. She didn't gloat. She simply gathered her papers and walked out, Amber's future still safe in her arms. A few days after the court hearing, Nora received an unexpected call from a woman named Tanya who introduced herself as the director of a local nonprofit organization. "We saw the video of you during the fire drill and heard from the school about the custody case," she said. "We're looking for someone with integrity, patience, and real-life experience to join our community outreach team. Would you be willing to meet?" Nora blinked in disbelief. She hadn't imagined anyone outside her small circle even noticed her. For so long, she had moved through the world invisible, useful, but unseen. At the interview, Tanya explained that the role involved organizing resources for low-income families, helping them access housing, education, and support. "We need someone who understands struggle, not just on paper, but in real life." Nora spoke honestly about her past, her present, and her hopes for the future. She didn't embellish anything. She didn't need to. By the end of the meeting, Tanya smiled. "We'd be lucky to have you." Nora accepted the offer, starting part-time while continuing her GED classes. It was the first job she'd had in years where she didn't need to carry a mop to be respected. Even after accepting the new job, Nora didn't quit her position at the school immediately. Something in her needed to leave on her own terms, not because she had to, but because she chose to. She continued showing up every morning, still in uniform, still carrying her cleaning cart, but something in her stride had changed. She wasn't walking out of failure. She was walking into a new chapter, one she had earned with every ounce of quiet perseverance. Her co-workers noticed. Even the teachers began treating her with a different tone. They didn't know the details, but they sensed the shift. On her last day at the school, Nora cleaned the hallway slowly, savoring the routine one final time. As she gathered her supplies, the principal approached with a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note, "You've done more for this school and its students than most ever will. Thank you." There was a round of applause in the break room, a bouquet of flowers from the teachers, and a long hug from the cafeteria staff. But what mattered most was Amber, who waited by the door with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, Mom." Nora smiled, finally believing those words for herself. The following weekend, Dylan arrived for a brief visit with Amber. His arrogance was dialed to full volume. He pulled up in a newly leased car and stepped out in designer shoes, sunglasses pushed up on his head. "Nice to see you finally got out of janitor duty," he said with a laugh as Nora answered the door. "Must have been tiring pretending you were okay." Nora didn't flinch. She was dressed in a smart blouse, her ID badge clipped neatly to her collar. "I didn't pretend," she replied calmly. "I just didn't need to explain myself to someone who never asked." He glanced around the apartment, now cleaner, cozier, with bookshelves and framed drawings on the wall. "Where's all this coming from?" he asked with a half-smirk. "Find a rich boyfriend?" Nora picked up her bag and handed him a sealed envelope. "You'll find the answer in here," she said. Dylan raised an eyebrow but didn't open it right away. He was still chuckling as he walked down the hallway with Amber. "You always loved your dramatic moments," he said over his shoulder. Nora watched him go, no longer angry, just sure that his smugness wouldn't last much longer. That night, Dylan finally opened the envelope. Inside were copies of financial statements, documentation of Nora's trust, her acceptance letter into an educational program, and a brief summary of her new role at the nonprofit. There was also a printed message at the bottom: "You said I'd never be more than a mop. Turns out, I was building a ladder." For a long time, he sat in silence, rereading the documents, face pale. His laughter from earlier now sounded hollow, even to himself. The truth stung, not because Nora had succeeded, but because she had done it without needing him. The next morning, Dylan called but Nora didn't answer. He left a voice message: "I didn't know. I mean, I guess, congratulations." It was the closest thing to an apology he'd ever offered. Nora didn't return the call. There was nothing left to say. The envelope had spoken for her, not with spite, but with clarity. She hadn't needed to argue or plead. Her growth had rendered his words powerless. And that, in itself, was justice enough. The following week, Dylan appeared uninvited at Amber's school after an event, pretending to be casual. He waited until Nora stepped out, then approached with a sheepish smile. "Look, about the things I said. I was wrong. I didn't mean all of it." Nora looked him in the eye, her expression calm but unreadable. "You meant it enough to say it in front of our daughter," she replied. He hesitated, then tried again. "I just wanted to clear the air. You deserve better, closure, or whatever." Nora took a deep breath. "Closure isn't something you give me, Dylan. It's something I earned the day I stopped needing your approval." His face dropped slightly, the confidence cracking. "But thanks for confirming everything I needed to know." Without waiting for a response, she walked past him and waved to Amber, who had just come outside. Dylan stood frozen, holding the apology she never asked for. Some lessons come late. Others come dressed in silence and self-respect. A week later, a reporter from a local station contacted Nora after hearing about her role in the fire drill and her recent promotion. At first, Nora hesitated; she wasn't interested in publicity. But the reporter was persistent, saying her story could inspire others facing similar struggles. After discussing it with Amber, Nora agreed to a quiet interview. Sitting in a small park, she spoke about motherhood, work, dignity, and how underestimated people often hold communities together without applause. She didn't embellish, didn't dramatize. She just told the truth. The story aired on a Sunday morning. Footage of the fire drill played alongside clips from her new job and shots of Amber working on her math homework at the kitchen table. By Monday, Nora's inbox was flooded with messages. Some were from strangers thanking her. Others were from organizations offering collaboration. But what struck her most was a note from a single mother across the city who wrote, "You gave me permission to try again." Nora printed it and pinned it on her fridge. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that one quiet voice could echo farther than she ever imagined. That summer, with part of her trust fund carefully budgeted, Nora planned a small trip, a weekend getaway to the mountains, something she and Amber had never done before. Amber had never stayed in a hotel or seen a real forest. They packed lightly, just enough for 3 days, and set off in a borrowed car, music playing through old speakers, windows half down. As they drove through winding roads and past tall pine trees, Amber pressed her face to the glass, wide-eyed with wonder. At the cabin, they hiked, roasted marshmallows, and read books by the fireplace. On the final night, Amber looked at her mom and said, "You know what this feels like? It feels like breathing." Nora smiled. "That's what rest is, sweetheart." They didn't need luxury, just space, time, and peace. For the first time in years, Nora fell asleep without running a mental list of unpaid bills. In that silence, under a blanket of stars, she felt something she hadn't dared feel in a long time, joy without guilt. In the fall, Nora was invited to speak at Amber's school for Career Day. She almost declined. Public speaking made her nervous, but Amber insisted. "You always say stories matter," she said. "Tell yours." Nora stood in the gymnasium, surrounded by posters of doctors, engineers, and business owners. She wore a modest navy dress and clutched a simple note card. When it was her turn, she walked to the front and looked at the rows of curious eyes, parents and students alike. "I was a janitor," she began. "And it was honest work. But it wasn't the whole story." She shared her path, not to impress, but to show that not every path is straight, and not every success comes in a suit. When she finished, the applause was quiet at first, then steady and full. Several parents approached afterward, some with questions, others with tears. But the most important feedback came from Amber, who hugged her tightly and whispered, "I want to be brave like you." Nora held her daughter close, knowing that courage, like stories, is something we pass down. Months passed, and word spread that Dylan had lost his job. The company he worked for had cut staff, and with no savings and poor references, he struggled to find stability. He moved into a friend's basement temporarily and stopped showing up for Amber's visits. Nora never gloated. She simply explained to Amber, gently, that sometimes people get lost when they never take the time to look inward. "We can care about someone," she said, "but we can't carry them." One day, Dylan sent a text. Just one line, "I'm sorry. I didn't know how to be better." Nora stared at it for a long time, then put her phone down. She didn't respond. Some apologies aren't meant to be returned. They're just echoes. And she had moved beyond echo chambers. Her life was full of work that mattered, a child who was thriving, and a version of herself that no longer needed anyone's permission to exist with pride. The day of the state math finals arrived. Amber stood on stage, one of 10 finalists, her name announced proudly. Nora sat in the front row, gripping the sides of her seat, heart pounding with every question her daughter answered. Amber's poise, her calm voice, her thoughtful eyes, everything Nora once dreamed for herself now lived in the girl beside her. When Amber won second place, the applause was thunderous. She smiled as she clutched her certificate, searching the crowd until she found Nora's eyes. Back at home, Amber placed the certificate beside her mom's GED diploma on the shelf. They stood side by side, both achievements framed not in glass, but in perseverance. That night, Nora whispered to Amber as she tucked her in, "You once said you wanted to be proud of me. But today, I want you to know, I'm proud of who you are becoming. And who I've become, because of you." They fell asleep under the same roof they once feared they'd lose. But now, it was more than shelter. It was home. A place rebuilt with grit, love, and stories worth remembering.